Hi there, and welcome back to this deep dive into the state of nature idea. If you're not sure what the state of nature is or why it's important, you might want to grab the first 2 episodes in this series and then come back to this one. Today we're going to take a detailed look at Rousseau's idea of the pure state of nature in his Discourse on the Origin and Basis of Inequality Among Men from 1755, which, thankfully, is often just abbreviated to the second discourse, and that's what we're going to call it in this episode. Now, this is where we're heading. A breakdown of Rousseau's state of nature into 7 distinct stages, leading from what he calls the pure state of nature right the way through to civil society. But before we get there, let's situate Rousseau's work on the state of nature in terms of the other classical social contract theories, because there's plenty of writers who have used and developed the social contract idea, but Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau tend to be singled out as the 3 most influential, and they tend to be referred to as classic social contract theorists, sometimes alongside others like Pufendorf and Kant. Now, Rousseau, as you can see on the timeline, is the last of these 3 to write on the social contract. He's a full century after Hobbes, and a good half-century after Locke. So then you'd be in your rights to ask, why are we going into Rousseau first in this series? Well, because he goes into more detail about the state of nature than either Hobbes or Locke do, particularly in his second discourse. And his thought, this is my intention, gives us a schema in terms of which we can then plot what Hobbes and Locke say and begin to make comparisons between them immediately. Now, there are 3 things that we need to bear in mind as we begin this deep dive into Rousseau's state of nature. The first is that Rousseau actually has 2 very distinct ideas of what the state of nature is, and it's not always easy to see how they fit together. The earlier account of the state of nature comes in the second discourse, and the picture of the state of nature that we get here is usually thought of as broadly positive. However, he returns to the idea 8 years later, in the Social Contract 1762, where he revises and he recontextualizes his view of the state of nature, and something very different comes out the other end. This account of the state of nature is rather negative. And in the same year as the Social Contract, he also publishes Emile, his treatise on the nature of education. And in this text, he further develops this more negative version of the state of nature idea. The second thing we need to bear in mind is that for the Rousseau of the second discourse, the state of nature is not a static state. He doesn't describe a sudden transition from the state of nature to a society under the social contract. He rather describes a gradual development in which the social contract becomes merely the logical final step in a process of incremental change that's been happening for quite a while. The third thing it's important to understand is that for the Rousseau of the second discourse, some stages of the state of nature paint an almost idyllic picture of happiness. It seems that this is a wonderful moment to be alive. But others are really quite grim, close to Thomas Hobbes' war of all against all. So when we talk about the state of nature for Rousseau, we don't mean one thing, we mean lots of very different, contrasting things. What all these stages have in common is that they stop short of civil society organised under the social contract. But quite frankly, that's almost all that they have in common. They're really very different from each other. Now, as we walk through Rousseau's pure state of nature, I'm going to be referring to the Cambridge Texts in the History of Political Thought edition, and my page numbers are going to come from there. But really helpfully, Rousseau breaks down his second discourse and of the social contract into parts and paragraphs. And so each time I'm going to refer to the part and paragraph first and then the page number in my edition afterwards. So if you're using a different edition, you can follow on hopefully without too much hassle. So then, let's take a deep dive into the state of nature idea in Rousseau's second discourse. In the second discourse, Rousseau tells the story of how humanity evolved from its earliest stages to the civil society that you and I live in today. And the critic Timothy O'Hagan has really quite helpfully, I think, divided Rousseau's account up into 7 stages that I've tried to represent in this diagram. Now, these stages are not absolute, and there's certainly some overlap between them, and Rousseau doesn't enumerate them himself, but I think dividing it up this way does give us a good sense of the development of Rousseau's state of nature and the different moments that characterise it. In this episode, we'll just be focusing on this first moment that Rousseau calls the moment of nascent man, or the pure state of nature. It's the stage most distant from us today, when, according to Rousseau, human beings first began to emerge. The first thing that Rousseau tells us about this moment is that there's no language in this state. Human communication is the odd grunt or shout, no syntactic language. Secondly, in this pure state of nature, nascent man enjoys what Rousseau calls natural freedom. Now, Rousseau doesn't actually use the term natural freedom in the passage on nascent man, but later in the discourse he says that this natural freedom has been lost, so I think we're well within our rights to read it back into this pure state of nature. And he does use the term natural freedom much more in the social contract later on as well. Natural freedom is our first key idea in social contract theory. It's been described as a pre-political non-dependence and also as an independent self-direction. So let's just unpack those dense terms and think carefully about what this idea of natural freedom is. In simple terms, in natural freedom, no one tells you what to do. If you want to take something, you just take it. If you want to eat something, you just eat it. If you want to kill someone, you just kill them. Now, there are 2 major limits on this kind of liberty. First of all, it depends on your skills. So, for example, if you want to eat fish and you're not very good at fishing, then tough, go and find some berries. Secondly, it's got the really quite inconvenient limit that if someone else wants to take something that's yours, or if someone else wants to kill you, then they just go ahead and do that. So, although this type of freedom can seem wonderfully emancipatory when we first come across it, the idea of being able to do whatever you want, for the Rousseau of the social contract, it's really quite limiting. And for the Hobbes of Leviathan, it's really quite frightening. But here, in Rousseau's second discourse, he paints really quite a pleasant picture of nascent humanity enjoying natural freedom. Just everyone getting on with life, not stepping on each other's toes, not getting in each other's way, certainly not killing each other at this stage. In the pure state of nature, Rousseau's anthropology of nascent humans has 2 main aspects. The first is sometimes translated as love of self. That's how the Rousseau scholar Nicolas Dent translates it. In French, it's amour de soi, literally love of the self. It contrasts with a term that we're going to look at in a later video, amour propre, that Dent translates as self-love, and elsewhere it's translated as vanity. Now, when amour propre emerges later on, we're going to see just how much damage it does to human beings and just what bad news it is. But thankfully, in the pure state of nature, there's no amour propre yet, and we're just dealing with amour de soi, which by stark contrast is really quite pleasant and works in very positive ways. This is how Rousseau describes it. Self-love, he says, is a natural sentiment, which inclines every animal to attend to its self-preservation, and which, guided in man by reason and modified by pity, produces humanity and virtue. Well, how lovely. This amour de soi then is a really good thing. It means that nascent humans don't throw themselves off cliffs and don't thrust their heads into fires because they've got a basic instinctual desire to take care of themselves. It keeps them alive, and it prepares the way for positive relationships as well. And in nascent humanity, it's an instinct. These nascent humans don't need to think about cultivating love of self. It's just something that they do, naturally. Now, I really want to emphasize just how fundamental this idea of amour de soi is for Rousseau and just what work it does for him. And so I want to hop over, if we could, to Emile for a moment, to eavesdrop on a passage where love of self is being described. And Rousseau writes, "Let us set down as an incontestable maxim that the first movements of nature are always right. There's no original perversity in the human heart. There is not a single vice to be found in it, of which it cannot be said how and whence it entered. The sole passion of natural man is amour de soi, or amour propre taken in an extended sense. So in Émile, he's taking amour propre as an umbrella term and saying amour de soi is the first stage of it. Don't be fooled by that. In the second discourse, they're very, very different things. You start off with amour de soi, and then later on in the development towards civil society, you get amour propre. So he's using it in two separate senses that we need to be aware of. This amour propre, and remember that by that in this text he's meaning amour de soi as the first stage in amour propre, in itself or relative to us is good and useful. And since it has no necessary relation to others, it is in this respect naturally neutral. It becomes good or bad only by the application made of it and the reasons given to it. Now, if you want to put one quotation from Rousseau up above your bed to summarise Rousseau in his most fundamental ideas, you could do worse than take the first sentence of this quotation. Let us set down as an incontestable maxim that the first movements of nature are always right. It's an extraordinary claim, isn't it? Think about everything that happens in nature and think of saying that everything there in its first movement is always, without exception, right. It's an extraordinary claim. It shows us just how much store Rousseau puts on the natural. Nature is always right. Now, in case you're thinking this is some remote and fanciful idea, let me try and convince you that we still live under the shadow of this cult of the natural today. Next time you're at the supermarket, for example, look at the shampoo aisle or the yogurt aisle or the peanut butter aisle, and I will wager you that a good half of the products in those aisles will proclaim that they have, quote, natural ingredients or are made from a, quote, natural formula. And they wouldn't do that if they didn't think that we value that we will buy it because it's natural, that we think it's better because it's natural. And in some measure, we have Rousseau to thank for that instinct in our own social imaginary. He did a lot to introduce this idea that the natural is good and the natural is pure. If you're intrigued by this idea and you want to examine it further, let me recommend to you Alan Levinowitz's beautifully written book, Natural, where he traces through how this cult of the natural manifests itself in different aspects of contemporary society. So, love of self is the first principle in Rousseau's anthropology of nascent humanity. The second major principle is pity, pitié in French. And like love of self, it's an instinct. And pity is actually shared for Rousseau not only by all humans, but also by animals as well. He describes pity as, quote, the only natural virtue, which the most extreme detractor of human virtues was forced to acknowledge. In other words, you cannot deny that humans feel pity, however jaundiced and cynical you are about human beings. Listen to how he describes it in the second discourse. It is a disposition suited to beings as weak and as subject to so many ills as we are, a virtue all the more universal and useful to man, as it precedes the existence of all reflection in him. Again, it's an instinct, and so natural that even the beasts sometimes show evident signs of it. Such is the pure movement of nature prior to all reflection. Such is the force of natural pity, which the most depraved morals still have difficulty destroying. He gives us three examples of this sort of pity, two of which actually come from the animal kingdom. We've got a horse that refuses to step on the dead bodies of other horses. We've got, quote, the mournful lowing of cattle entering the slaughterhouse. And his other example is the tenderness that mothers feel toward their young. All of these, he says, are examples of the instinct of pity. Now, he also adds a rather gruesome story to these three examples, and it's a story intended to show that even the most negative observers of human nature must acknowledge human pity. And it's taken from a text called The Fable of the Bees, which is generally pretty down on human nature. And even the author of that text, he says, when he comes to this story, must change his tone and recognise some pity in himself. So brace yourselves for a rather gruesome story. Quote, "The pathetic picture of a man locked up, so presumably inside either a prison or a house, who outside, through bars or windows, sees a ferocious beast tearing a child from his mother's breast, breaking his weak limbs with its murderous fangs, and tearing the child's throbbing entrails with its claws." Close quote. Now, if you were not moved in some way by that description, Rousseau would say, you are beyond the pale of humanity, because even the most cynical observers of human nature will evince compassion and sensitivity at that story. So I hope you did. Now, this pity is really quite a remarkable instinct for Rousseau. In fact, it is the root, and I do not exaggerate here, of all virtue. He writes, "What are generosity, clemency, humanity, if not pity applied to the weak, the guilty, or the species in general? Even benevolence and friendship, properly understood, are the products of a steady pity, focused on a particular object. For what else is it to wish that someone not suffer than to wish that he be happy?" This pity is, if you like, Rousseau's ethical and moral Swiss army knife. If there's a job that needs doing, it's pity that can do it for him. Just listen to this quotation, where he runs through all the different things that pity does. "It is pity that carries us without reflection to the assistance of those we see suffer. Pity that in the state of nature takes the place of laws, morals and virtue, with the advantage that no one is tempted to disobey its gentle voice. Pity that will keep any sturdy savage from robbing a weak child or an infirm old man of his hard-won subsistence, if he can hope to find his own elsewhere. Pity that, in the place of that sublime maxim of reasoned justice, 'Do unto others as you would have them do unto you,' inspires in all men this other maxim of natural goodness, much less perfect, but perhaps much more useful than the first. 'Do your good with the least possible harm to others.'" Well, as we can see in this passage, pity is Rousseau's way of constructing a state in which people act as if there were laws and as if there were morality without actually having to have laws or morality. We're still in the state of nature, we're still behaving by instinct, but people are behaving in a law-abiding type way, in a moral type way. Why? Because of this wonderful thing called pity, which is cultivating all these virtues in them. And note also that pity is an instinctual secular substitute for the Christian golden rule. It's even doing the job of religion, as far as religion is a moralizing force. And it also acts as a natural instinctual balance to the amour de soi. So amour de soi causes us to want to care for ourselves and preserve our own lives and not stick our heads in fires. But pity turns us away from ourselves towards others, to care for them and not simply for ourselves. And so there's a wonderful natural balance between amour de soi and pitié in Rousseau's pure state of nature. They work wonderfully together to create these rounded, compassionate, caring, self-sufficient, self-satisfied human beings in this pure state of nature. In the pure state of nature, Rousseau thinks that life is solitary, so no families, no clans, no tribes. And this solitariness is very important for Rousseau because it means that nascent man's sense of itself is not dependent on how others perceive you. This is going to become very important when we get amour propre later on, which is all about judging yourself by how others perceive you. But in this pure state of nature, life is solitary. Couples meet to procreate, Rousseau thinks, and then they just go their separate ways. And as soon as a child is no longer dependent on its mother, it makes its own way in life. Very solitary idea of human existence. No families, no clans, no tribes. And finally, there's no private property in this state. everything's held in common. Now again, later on in the second discourse, Rousseau is going to show us just how important private property is. And in fact, he begins the second part of the second discourse with an excoriation of private property, laying at its door all manner of social ills. So the fact that it's absent from this pure state of nature is very important. So then, what are we to make of this pure state of nature that Rousseau describes? I think it raises at least three fundamental questions that still shape our understanding of ourselves and of society today. First of all, is humanity something natural or something that's produced and artificial? Secondly, do human beings retain an inner core of animality? And thirdly, which came first, humans or society? And what I want to do for the rest of this episode is just to look at each of these fundamental questions in turn. Questions that really get to the heart of how we understand ourselves as a species. So then, first of all, is humanity something natural or something produced and artificial? To put it bluntly, in this pure state of nature, are we dealing with humans or not? Well, Rousseau is somewhat ambiguous. In the second discourse, he writes, "Such was the condition of nascent man, such was the life of an animal, at first restricted to pure sensations." So this nascent man, it appears in the second discourse, is also an animal, both at the same time. There's an overlap between the animal and the human in the state of nature. Humanity is therefore natural. Remember this golden word for Rousseau. Humanity is natural. Humanity is part of the animal kingdom. But if we skip over to of the social contract, Rousseau draws a very clear distinction that seems to contradict the earlier description in the second discourse. In the social contract, he writes, he, i.e. man, humanity, should ceaselessly bless the happy moment which wrested him from it, i.e. the state of nature, forever, and out of a stupid and bounded animal made an intelligent being and a man. That's very different, isn't it? This makes it sound like there's a clear break between animality on the one hand and humanity on the other. The stupid animals of the state of nature become intelligent humans when they leave that state. The question for any Rousseau scholar arises, therefore, is it possible to reconcile these two? Well, yes and no. It is possible to reconcile the two if we say that the 6 stages of the state of nature in the second discourse are compressed into one moment in the social contract. And if you concertina them up like that, then it does seem as if you go rather precipitously from animality to humanity and civil society in one jump. But if you stretch them out, as you do in the second discourse, you see that there are a lot of stages in between. But it's also possible, and many Rousseau scholars have taken it this way, to see these two as really awkwardly and fundamentally irreconcilably different accounts of the relationship between animality and humanity. And there is a huge amount that hangs on the difference between those two interpretations. Whether the animal abruptly stops as the human starts, or whether there's a gradual transition and an overlap between animality and humanity. What is at stake in this difference is the question of whether society makes us human, or whether we were human all along. If the animals in the state of nature are also humans already, as Rousseau seems to suggest in the second discourse, then humanity is natural. And if humanity is natural, then there's a baseline human condition. There's a universal human norm against which all other instances of humanity can be measured. The state of nature, in other words, provides us with a norm, a straight line on this slide, in relation to which social humanity deviates. Everything that's not the state of nature is not natural, and therefore not normal. But, on the other hand, if you need the social contract in order to have true humans, as Rousseau seems to be suggesting in the later of the social contract, then humanity is constructed. Humanity is something artificial. And if humanity is constructed and artificial, then there's no fundamental natural norm to human existence, and humanity is an artifact all the way down and all the way back. And if humanity is an artifact all the way down and all the way back, if humanity is something of our own making, then it's a great deal easier to see how we could remake it and reconstruct it as we see fit, because there's no natural norm against which we need to measure humanity in the first place. I hope I'm beginning to be able to make clear that this is a huge question, isn't it? A fundamental question for the way in which we see ourselves today. So I want to pause for a moment and just throw it out to you. What do you think? If you stripped away from human beings all language, all intelligence, all society, all tools, all clothes, all dwelling, in short, all culture and society, would whatever it was that you were left with still be human? Now, your answer to that question is going to tell you a lot about your view of the world and of society. Let's keep going with these questions. Is there a natural baseline condition of humanity that can provide a yardstick against which to measure our own society? In other words, is there a natural humanity from which you can deviate to make an unnatural humanity? What do you think? Here's a third question. Can we ever say of a given practice or demand, that's not natural? Asking people to do that isn't natural. And if we can say that, what moral or normative value does that pronouncement have? We may well say it's unnatural, but does that mean it's wrong? Does that mean it should be avoided? Again, your answer to those questions is going to tell you a huge amount about the way you see humans and society. And this is a microcosm of the debate today between humanism and posthumanism, and humanism and transhumanism, and this whole thorny issue of the question of human enhancements, whether they're chemical or electronic enhancements. On the left hand of this slide, we can see the social contract as a huge human technological enhancement itself. Not microchips in our brains or injections to make us run faster or think more deeply, to be sure, but just as effective in enhancing our capabilities and our quality of life. The social contract itself as human enhancement. And on this view, there's simply no humanity at all without artificial enhancements, because the social contract that made us human in the first place is itself an artificial enhancement. So then the contemporary debates about chemical or bionic enhancements are redundant. That boat sailed a long time ago. We accepted artificial enhancements the moment that we became human at all on this view. According to this line of thinking, if we continue to enhance ourselves, we're simply doing more of the thing that made us human in the first place, and therefore to refuse human enhancement is to refuse humanity per se. Just as very few people today would say, let's dismantle society and go back to hunter-gathering because society is unnatural. Well, in the same way, we shouldn't go back on human enhancements on the basis that they're unnatural. Humans, on this view, have never been natural in the first place. That's an ideology. That's a fantasy. So that's the first view. The second view on the right of this diagram is that it is natural humans who enter society. And as they do so, they maintain some of their naturalness. And on this view, there is a baseline norm to which we can move closer and from which we can move further away. There is a measure for humanity 101, if you like, humanity's simplicity. And on this view, humanity exists in a pure and natural state without any artificial enhancements at all. So the contemporary debates about chemical or bionic enhancements are about distorting or changing this original purity. And once the genie of enhancement is out of the bottle, we won't be able to put it back in again. And according to this line of thinking, if we continue to enhance ourselves, we're going further and further down this rabbit hole from which there's no return. The more we enhance humans, the more inhuman we get. And this debate is fundamental, isn't it? And these two positions are very different to each other. Who is human and who isn't? And what are the limits of humanity? Where does humanity begin? When did humanity begin? And also, where does it end? How much do we have to enhance ourselves before we're not human anymore? There's also a lot at stake in the question of whether we think that humans retain some animality within them when they enter civil society or when they leave the state of nature, or whether the break with animality is irreversible when they become human. Now, if you think that animals became human beings, but the animal still haunts us and we always can regress to an animal condition, then you've got a sort of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde situation, in which the animal of the state of nature always remains somewhere locked up deep within us, ready to emerge if humanity breaks down. It's also the Lord of the Flies syndrome, isn't it? Take people out of society, take these artificial guardrails away, and you'll soon see the animal return. On this view, the animal remains with us almost like a little person, a homunculus inside our heads, or the so-called lizard brain of the limbic system, one of the most ancient parts of our brain to develop, the animal brain that still sort of controls our basest instincts. But if you think that the break with animality is a once and for all moment, an irreversible break with the past in which humans become human and are no longer animal, then your picture of animals and humans is going to be something like the transformation between Luke Skywalker on Tatooine and Luke the Rebel Leader in Star Wars A New Hope. And the idea here is that once Luke leaves his childhood home, he can never go back to the way it was before. He can never unlearn what he's learned. His life is forever transformed, irreversibly. And on this view, humanity is something like an onion. You can keep peeling off the layers of culture and society and language, and what you end up with is not some inner core of animality. If you take away everything that's artificial, you end up with nothing at all. There's nothing left of humanity if you strip all these cultural accretions away. And this second Star Wars view is what in philosophical language you could call an event. In other words, something happens and things are never the same as they were again. There's no going back. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. You can't turn back the clock. It isn't reversible. You can't shrink the force-wielding, victorious Luke back into his Tatooine life. You can't unlearn what he learned. There's one more huge question at stake in Rousseau's Pure State of Nature, and it's this. Do individual humans come together to make society? Or do you actually need society already in order to have humans? Now, understandably, most modern philosophers and political theorists have made a lot of this question of the relationship between humanity and society. I want particularly to focus on one for this video, Jean-Luc Nancy. And he reads this, quote, stupid and bounded animal passage from the social contract to mean that we only become human when we leave the state of nature. In a text called Neum, and also in the better known book The Sense of the World, Nancy insists that there is no natural man for the Rousseau of the social contract. Natural man is an animal, he says. Humanity is civil humanity. So in order to have humanity, you have to have civil society, for Rousseau, Nancy thinks. It's the social contract that makes us human, says Nancy. And the civil state, he says in The Sense of the World, is the only proper and original state of humanity. Take away civil society, you've got animals. You don't have humans anymore. That's Nancy's reading of Rousseau's Of the Social Contract. But, hold on. There's a problem. Who does the contracting? If you don't have humans until you have civil society, who inaugurates the social contract that makes civil society? Was it stupid and bounded animals? Of course not. They can't do that. It's got to be human beings. So wait a minute. You need human beings to make the contract, but you need the contract to make human beings. It's like the chicken and the egg, isn't it? Which comes first? They both need each other. The social contract presupposes humans capable of contracting. surely, doesn't it? But humans presuppose the contract that made them human. So humans must precede humans in order to make humans, if Nancy's reading of Rousseau's of the social contract is right. In Neum, Nancy explains it in these terms. He writes, the whole of the stakes and aporia of the social contract is that the connection is contemporaneous with the terms it connects. In other words, the social bond that brings us together in society appears at the same time as the people it brings together. That's the whole contract right there. When it says there that it's in civil society that humanity becomes human, there is no natural man. Rousseau says explicitly, natural man is a beast. Humanity is civil humanity. Today we need to take another look at Rousseau's contract and rethink it, starting from this profound motif of the absolutely contemporaneous connection of the terms it connects. And Nancy calls this the paradox of institution. And in fact, it's the paradox of all constitutions that bring into being a nation and a people. Take the American Constitution, for example, with its famous beginning, "We the people." Now, the legitimacy of the Constitution rests, of course, on the people. It's in the people's name that the nation is founded. But the people, as a unified and distinct group, are only really brought into being by the act of constitution itself. Derrida, in his own text where he's thinking through these ideas, calls this the mystical foundation of authority. In other words, all foundational constitutions fail to justify themselves by anything outside themselves and before themselves. They've got to bootstrap themselves into authority. The "we the people" is brought about by the constitution that we the people are supposed to legitimate. So what's at stake here, you can see, is the legitimacy of society. If political authority is founded on a circularity like this, then political authority is contradictory. It's unstable. And if humanity is founded on a circularity like this, then humanity is contradictory and unstable. And notice the parallels between these 2 points about the naturalness of humanity and the well-foundedness of political authority. In both these cases, there's an opposition, isn't there? There's an opposition between humanity as natural and humanity as artificial. And there's an opposition between political authority as legitimate and political authority as illegitimate. We might even say political authority as natural or artificial. In both these cases, there's one pole of this binary that makes for stability and very clear, unambiguous norms. That's thinking of humanity as natural and thinking of there being a legitimate foundation for political authority. In both those cases, you know where you stand. There's a measure of humanity and there's a justification for political authority. But the other term in the binary problematizes and destabilizes the humanity and political authority in turn. So if humanity is artificial, there's no baseline humanity, there's no measure. And if political authority has an illegitimate foundation, then it's always unstable as well. And this is also the opposition between, interestingly enough, theology and the secular, as Nancy realizes in his text Politique et au-delà, Politics and Beyond. In that text, he comes back to Rousseau and he says, look, if humanity is natural, if political authority is legitimate, then we're still in the world of theology and the divine order. There is, if you like, a sky anchor for ideas like humanity and political legitimacy. We've got something to grab onto in terms of these things. But if humanity is artificial, and if political authority rests on a circularity, then we find ourselves without guiding norms, without reference points, in a way that is very reminiscent of Nietzsche's evocative picture of the world after the death of God in The Gay Science. So as I read this passage from Nietzsche, think about artificial humanity and political authority without any final legitimacy. Nietzsche writes, how could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? It's an amazing passage, isn't it? This passage could describe a humanity without natural norms. It could describe a society without legitimate authority, unmoored, drifting around with no yardstick to measure itself against. And this is Nancy's verdict then on Rousseau's social contract in Politics and Beyond. He says, for this reason, there is an extraordinary modernity in Rousseau that spans across to Hegel and even Marx and Husserl. He opens the door to the most complete, the most anxious modernity, one that doesn't rest on any humanism that's been substituted for theology, but that understands that humanity is the source of unfathomable contradictions. This is quite remarkable, isn't it? For Nancy, Rousseau is the first thinker truly to understand the death of God, many decades before Nietzsche came up with the term. Because for the Christian tradition, and for Augustine in particular, humanity was always open to something beyond it, something greater than it. In Augustine's famous phrase from the Confessions, God is, quote, more inward than my most inward part and higher than the highest element within me. Humanity always exists in the presence of God, who exceeds humanity. But Rousseau has no such opening of humanity onto something bigger, something infinite. For Rousseau, there is no great overarching interest that gathers together all human interests. And to recognise that is to live in the shadow of the death of God. Now, there are some pretty unpleasant associations of seeing human beings in the state of nature as not fully human. It may be that as I've been running through these thoughts, some of them have been occurring to you already. But remember that for thinkers like Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau, the state of nature wasn't only a condition of humans in the dim and distant past, but it's the condition of humans outside civil society today when they were writing. Hunter-gatherer communities, and often they'll refer to the people of the Americas. And if people outside the social contract are not fully human, then these people groups are not fully human either. As Charles Mills points out in his book, The Racial Contract, time and time again, denying full humanity to groups of people is a racist move. Let me quote Mills concatenating different moments where this denial of humanity to people outside the white social contract has occurred. He writes, W.E.B. Du Bois represents blacks as a tertium quid, somewhere between men and cattle, close quote. Comments that liberty, justice and right are marked, quote, for white people only, and suggests that the statement I am white is becoming the one fundamental tenet of our political morality. Malcolm X asserts that America has not only deprived us of the right to be a citizen, she has deprived us of the right to be human beings, the right to be recognised and respected as men and women. We're fighting for recognition as human beings. Frantz Fanon maps a colonial world divided between, quote, two different species, a governing race and zoological natives, in other words, natives denied full humanity. Aimé Césaire argues that, quote, the coloniser, in order to ease his conscience, gets into the habit of seeing the other man as an animal. Colonisation is thingification. Now, this all sounds very uncomfortably close, doesn't it, to the debate around whether the beings in the state of nature are fully human or not. and to how we understand the paradox of institution that haunts Rousseau's of the social contract.